24 months after my wife's passing, my daughter dragged me into a hall of justice because she hungered to seize a seven-figure portion of my estate. He requires immediate psychiatric intervention, she declared, her voice as brittle as ice, while her counselor erupted in a jagged laugh. She alleged that I had spiraled out of control, claiming I was no longer fit to govern my own existence. Yet, I remained a statue. I offered no rebuttal. I didn't raise my voice in defense. Then, the magistrate shifted his gaze toward her lawyer and posed a question that paralyzed every soul in the gallery. Is it possible that you truly have no idea who this man is? The attorney turned to stone. My daughter's complexion drained until she was as pale as a ghost. And that was the precise second the gravity of the room shifted. I kept my hands interlaced upon the mahogany, fingertips burrowing into my palms. Across the aisle, my daughter was imploring a judge to brand me as a man of diminished capacity. The sterile glow of the courtroom fixtures hummed with a monotonous, electric vibration, bathing the proceedings in a harsh, clinical light. October 15, 2024, 10:47 a.m. Beyond the thick glass panes, a relentless rain smeared the world into a gray blur. Inside, Vivian stood at the lectern, clad in a sharp navy blazer, her hair coiled into a severe, professional bun. She projected total composure and image of absolute certainty. Her tone never faltered. Your Honor, my father is no longer equipped to oversee his own interests. He has severed his familial ties. He has surrendered his livelihood. He displays the unmistakable hallmarks of profound melancholy and total withdrawal. Judge Theodore Vance, a man in his early 60s with eyes like polished flint, listened in unreadable silence. Vivian's legal representative, Douglas Thorne, a man in an expensive tailored suit, tapped his screen with practiced precision. A series of images flickered onto the monitors mounted to the walls. The first was me, standing solitary in the produce aisle of a market, lingering near the fruit. The overhead lighting had been manipulated to make me appear hollow-eyed, gaunt, and wandering. Then another, me perched on a park bench in Westport Heights, staring blankly into the distance. Stripped of their context, they were a curated gallery of decline, visual evidence of a crumbling mind. Mr. Sterling has been placed on an indefinite leave of absence from his professional duties, Thorne announced. He has ceased responding to his daughter's outreach. He has constructed a wall between himself and those who supposedly matter most. I sat 10 feet away, a ghost in my own hearing. My counsel, Sarah Jenkins, sat at my side with a slender, closed folder. She had instructed me to remain a void, to offer no reaction, so I obeyed. But beneath the edge of the table, my jaw was locked so fiercely that my teeth throbbed. Judge Vance leaned over the petition. Miss Sterling, for what duration has your father exhibited this purported incapacity? Roughly 2 years, Your Honor. Vivian's voice was a masterpiece of rehearsed concern. His condition deteriorated sharply following the passing of my grandfather in late summer. And you are seeking comprehensive financial jurisdiction? Yes, Your Honor. Solely for his own safeguarding. The words struck the air like heavy stones. For his own safeguarding. Judge Vance turned his sharp gaze toward Sarah. Ms. Jenkins, does your client intend to provide a rebuttal at this stage? Sarah rose, her dark blazer crisp, her reading glasses dangling from a silver chain. Not at this moment, Your Honor. However, we shall provide a comprehensive response within the designated time frame. The judge's eyes locked onto mine, searching for a tremor, a sign of the madness they claimed I possessed. Mr. Sterling, do you comprehend the gravity and the nature of this petition? I do, Your Honor, I replied. My voice was low, steady, and held the weight of a secret they were not yet prepared to handle. My voice resonated through the room, steady, resonant, and entirely devoid of the frailty they had spent the morning trying to project. I caught the briefest flicker of panic in Vivian's eyes. She had banked on my silence, expecting a man crushed by grief to simply roll over and let the gavel fall. Judge Theodore Vance shifted his attention back to Douglas Thorne. Counselor, you've asserted that Mr. Sterling has suffered a loss of livelihood. I require clarity on those circumstances. Thorne adjusted his tie, his confidence wavering for the first time. He was separated from his role as a senior risk strategist, Your Honor. The termination was reportedly performance-based. The judge turned to my daughter. Miss Sterling, Is this an accurate representation? Vivian hesitated, her polished facade showing a hairline fracture. That is my understanding, yes. Your understanding? Vance repeated, his voice like a low-frequency hum. You aren't certain? He ceased all meaningful dialogue with me. Your Honor, she countered, trying to regain her footing. But that is exactly the pattern we are highlighting. The withdrawal, the refusal to communicate regarding fundamental life matters. Judge Vance's eyes settled on me. Mr. Sterling? I met his gaze without blinking. That characterization is fundamentally flawed, Your Honor. I was placed on administrative leave pending an internal inquiry. That audit concluded 14 days ago. I was exonerated of every allegation and offered a full reinstatement along with a formal letter of apology from the executive board. The courtroom fell into a vacuum of silence. Vivian's expression remained frozen, but her knuckles were white against the wood of the podium. Thorne shifted his weight, his polished shoes squeaking on the linoleum. Your Honor, we were unaware of these developments. Evidently, Judge Vance remarked, making a sharp note on the file. Miss Sterling, you've alleged cognitive decline and a total inability to manage fiscal responsibilities. Do you possess any clinical documentation to validate this? Not formal medical records at this juncture, Your Honor, but his behavior over the preceding 24 months. So, the judge interrupted, no psychiatric evaluation has been performed. No, Your Honor. No neurological diagnostics. No signed affidavit from a physician. We believe the gravity of the situation necessitates immediate intervention, Your Honor, which is why. Counselor Thorne, Vance's tone turned razor-sharp. You are petitioning for an emergency conservatorship. That legal threshold requires a demonstration of imminent peril, imminent financial ruin, or an immediate risk to health and safety. I am struggling to locate the imminent in any part of this petition. Thorne stood up straighter, his voice rising in desperation. Your Honor, we believe the totality of the circumstances, the perceived job loss, the isolation, the refusal to engage. But Mr. Sterling just clarified that the job loss was a misconception, the judge pointed out. He was cleared and reinstated. That single fact dismantles a substantial pillar of your argument. Do you have any evidence of reckless spending? Defaulted loans? Eviction notices? Thorne hesitated, the silence stretching uncomfortably long. Not at this time, Your Honor, but given his psychological state, which, Vance finished for him, has not been assessed by a single medical professional. Vivian leaned toward her lawyer, whispering something frantic into his ear. Thorne shook his head slightly, his jaw set in a hard line. Judge Vance looked over at Sarah Jenkins. Ms. Jenkins, does your client wish to present any further evidence at this time? Sarah rose with a calm, surgical precision. Your Honor, we possess substantial evidence that will diametrically oppose the narrative that Mr. Sterling is either mentally or financially compromised. We will be filing a comprehensive response that includes documentation of his high-level professional background, his current financial solvency, and the actual, darker motivations behind this petition. She paused, letting the weight of her words hang in the air. We shall respond in full, Your Honor. The judge nodded slowly, his eyes fixed on Vivian, who looked as though she had just realized the trap was closing on her instead of me. This hearing is continued for 2 weeks. October 29th, 9 a.m., this courtroom. Judge Theodore Vance's voice was final, a gavel strike in verbal form. In the interim, I am ordering a temporary freeze on all joint accounts and assets shared between Mr. Sterling and the petitioner pending resolution. Mr. Sterling's personal accounts remain under his sole and absolute control. Vivian's face drained of color. The very funds she likely intended to use to pay Douglas Thorne's exorbitant legal fees were now encased in judicial ice. Court was adjourned. The sharp crack of the gavel echoed against the marble walls. Vivian turned immediately to Thorne, her composure disintegrating into low, panicked whispers. Thorne was already frantically stuffing papers into his briefcase, the smugness he'd worn 10 minutes ago replaced by a look of sheer calculation, the kind a man wears when he realizes he's on the losing side of a high-stakes gamble. Sarah Jenkins closed her folder, the thin file still unopened. 2 weeks, she said quietly. We'll be ready. I stood slowly. Across the aisle, Vivian looked at me for the first time since the hearing began. There was no warmth there, only the cold calculation of a predator who had missed her first strike. I didn't look away. I didn't blink. I let her see the man she thought was broken. She turned and swept out of the room, Thorn trailing behind her like a shadow losing its light. "You did well," Sarah whispered, touching my arm. "Stay quiet. Let her think she rattled you." "She didn't," I said. "I know, but let her believe it anyway. It makes them sloppy." I watched through the heavy glass of the courtroom doors. In the hallway, Vivian and Thorn stood in a tense huddle, his hands gesturing wildly while her arms were crossed tight enough to bruise. She looked back once through the glass, her eyes searching for a crack in my armor. I remained a statue. The most agonizing part wasn't the lies she'd told today. It was the sheer meticulousness of her betrayal. Every distorted photograph, every curated bank statement, every rehearsed inflection. She had been architecting this assassination for months. But so had I. I just needed her to commit to her narrative first. I needed her to sign her name to the lies before I revealed the truth. Because this wasn't the first time Vivian had called me a disappointment. The first time didn't happen in a sterile courtroom. It happened in a house that has since been leveled, on an evening that smelled of burnt pasta and the slow rot of regret. It was 2016. 8 years ago. Vivian was 24. My wife, Lydia, had just informed me that she wanted a divorce. The papers sat on the kitchen table, neat, organized, and final. Vivian had come home that weekend, not to offer me comfort, but to help her mother dismantle our life together. I was in the garage when she found me. I'd been sorting through old, heavy file boxes, relics from a life she never knew I possessed. Inside those boxes were FBI case summaries, commendations for exceptional service under duress, evidence logs, and wiretap transcripts. All of it was labeled, dated, and legally useless in my civilian life. "Mom says you're done," she said. It wasn't a question, it was a verdict. "That's right," I replied, my back to her. "Good." Her voice was a flat line. "You were never really here anyway." I looked up, the dust of 30 years on my hands. "Vivian, don't. You were always working," she snapped, her voice finally rising. "Always on a call, always traveling for the firm. You missed everything. Birthdays, my graduation from Yale, the recitals. You chose the job over us every single time." I stopped. How could I explain it? How could I tell her that the risk analyst job at the firm was a front? That the reason I was gone was because I was standing between her and the fallout of a global human trafficking ring? That in 2011, I had walked away from a director-level position at the Bureau because 3 of the men I had put away had figured out my real name? I had disappeared into the shadows of a boring corporate life specifically to keep the crosshairs off her forehead. I had signed a non-disclosure agreement with the Department of Justice that carried a prison sentence if breached. So, I stayed silent. And Vivian took that silence as a confession. "You're a disappointment, Dad," she said quietly. It wasn't angry anymore. It was worse. It sounded like a truth she had finally been allowed to say out loud. Mom deserved better. We all did. Then she walked back inside, leaving me alone with the boxes of a hero's life that my own daughter viewed as a coward's excuse. I should have seen it coming. The resentment didn't start in that courtroom on October 15th. It had been simmering since 2016, a slow-acting poison that had finally reached its lethal dose. The resentment didn't manifest overnight. It was a slow-motion collapse that began years before the divorce. When Vivian turned 13, the house was decorated in shades of violet, her favorite color. There was a cake with purple frosting waiting on the counter. I had promised to be through the door by 4 p.m. I didn't arrive until 9 p.m. A multi-state syndicate we'd been tracking had fractured that afternoon. Arrests were cascading across state lines, and as the lead coordinator, I had to be the glue holding the operation together. The paperwork was the kind that wouldn't wait for a birthday wish. When I finally turned the key in the lock, the house was a tomb, save for the flickering light of the kitchen. Lydia sat there, her silhouette sharp against the wall. The cake sat untouched, the candles having surrendered and melted into the icing like wax tears. She cried for an hour, Lydia said, not looking up. After that, she simply stopped asking where you were. I retreated upstairs and knocked on Vivian's door. "Go away," came the muffled reply. "I'm sorry, Viv. The case. You're always sorry. And there's always a case." Her voice splintered. "I don't care anymore, Dad. Just leave." I stood in that hallway for an eternity before retreating. The next morning, I tried the only thing I knew, reparations. I took her to breakfast and bought her the rare edition book she'd been eyeing. She was civil, but the warmth was gone. She treated me with the polite distance one affords a stranger performing an unnecessary favor. That was the first fracture in the foundation. 6 years later, I walked away from the bureau. I didn't do it out of a desire for a quiet life. I did it because the walls were closing in. Vivian was 19, away at university, and I told her I was transitioning into consulting. She didn't ask for details. By then, she'd stopped asking me anything of substance. What she didn't know, what the laws of federal secrecy forbade me from saying, was that my settling was a survival tactic. An investigation had been compromised. The wolves I had been hunting had caught my scent. They knew my name, my address, and most importantly, they knew about her. The threats began as whispers and evolved into explicit blueprints for violence. The Bureau presented a silent exit, early retirement, classified records, and protection through total anonymity. In exchange, I had to become ordinary. Forgettable. I accepted the deal to shield Vivian, Julian, and Lydia. But through Vivian's eyes, I wasn't a protector, I was a quitter. She saw a man who had traded ambition for invisibility. In her world, invisible soon became synonymous with useless. She had no idea that the quiet man, working from a home office, had spent 20 years dragging predators out of the shadows. She didn't know that bounties had been placed on the heads of federal agents' families. She didn't know that in 2011, my supervisor had looked me in the eye and told me to disappear or risk losing my daughter forever. I carried that weight in silence, and Vivian translated that silence into failure. Julian was more empathetic. He reached out, tried to bridge the gap. But Vivian had already closed the case on me, and the verdict she reached was disappointment. The irony was a bitter pill. I had sacrificed my identity to ensure her safety, and she loathed me for the vacuum I had created. It wasn't until years later, after my father passed, that the final piece of the puzzle clicked into place. I found his personal journal tucked away in a bedside drawer. The handwriting was tremulous, the words of a man losing his grip on the present. Vivian asked me to sign something today. I don't understand what it is, but she says it's for the best. In that moment, the disappointed daughter persona evaporated, and I saw the predator underneath. I had spent over 2 decades investigating financial crimes. I knew exactly what elder exploitation looked like. I recognized the patterns of isolation, the subtle coercion, and the web of intermediaries used to mask a money trail. I had been watching Vivian execute a textbook bust out on my own father's estate. She thought she was playing a game with a tired old man who had lost his edge. She forgot that my father had taught me the value of patience, and the Bureau had taught me how to hunt. And somewhere between that dusty garage in 2016 and the fragmented journal I discovered in 2024, I unearthed a bitter, final truth. The people you love most are capable of the atrocities you'd least expect. Sometimes, the only way to rescue them from their own corruption is to step aside and let the gears of justice do what a father's heart cannot. If there was one soul who truly perceived the man behind the mask, it was my father, Victor Sterling. At 84, he was a retired mathematics instructor who balanced his ledgers every Sunday and archived every receipt in meticulously labeled envelopes. Yet, 3 weeks after we laid him to rest, my daughter had the audacity to claim I had abandoned him. Let me take you back to 1989. I was 23 years old. My father drove me to the federal building in Portland for my first morning of duty. We were men of few words, but as we idled in the shadows of the parking garage, he turned to me with a gravity I can still feel. "I'm proud of you, Arthur. You're about to witness things most people are shielded from. You're about to carry weights most men would buckle under. But remember this, do the right thing when it's grueling, especially then." At 23, I possessed the arrogance to think I understood him. I didn't. Not even close. My father had taught calculus for nearly 4 decades. He revered numbers because numbers were incapable of deception. They either reconciled or they didn't. There was a mathematical correctness to the universe that was beyond debate. When I first told him I intended to join the Bureau, he asked only one question: why? "Because I want to intercept the people who prey on the vulnerable," I told him. He nodded slowly, as if verifying the variables in an equation. "That is a sound reason. Don't let the world take it from you." I never did. 22 years later, When I sat him down to explain why I was surrendering my badge, about the compromised case, the shadows following Vivian, and the necessity of disappearing, Victor listened with a silence that was absolute. Finally, he spoke. You're shielding them. Yes, and they can never know why. No, he agreed, leaning forward, his eyes sharp behind his spectacles. Arthur, they may never comprehend this. Lydia might lose her way. Vivian might look at you and see a man who folded. But I see the sacrifice, and I know it's the heaviest burden you've ever had to shoulder. He was a prophet. Lydia didn't understand. Vivian interpreted my silence as a lack of spine. But Victor saw the armor I had donned. After I transitioned into my ordinary life, my father called every Sunday morning without fail. He never asked if I mourned my career. He knew I did. He also knew I'd make the same trade 1,000 times over to keep them breathing. Then came January 2023. Victor suffered a stroke, minor in physical damage, but it left him fragile. Suddenly, Vivian's cold shoulder thawed. She began visiting him with a frequency that felt like a blessing. Dad, I'm heading over to check on Grandpa. Stay home. I've got it under control. Initially, I felt a surge of gratitude. I allowed myself to hope that this was her path back to us. But Victor became guarded, watchful. One afternoon, I arrived at his house unannounced. Vivian was there, a sea of documents hemorrhaging across the mahogany dining table. Just some clerical work, she said, her voice a pitch too high as she gathered the papers. Grandpa's been neglecting the utilities. I'm just getting him organized. When she stepped into the kitchen, Victor's eyes met mine. She's very helpful, he said. His tone was tight, laden with subtext. Is everything all right, Dad? I prompted. He hesitated, a shadow of fear crossing his face. Nothing. Just stay close, Arthur. I should have listened to the veteran investigator inside me, but I chose to listen to the father who wanted to believe his daughter was capable of grace. Over the following months, Vivian's assistance became a wall. Victor stopped calling on Sundays. When I questioned it, Vivian insisted he was merely exhausted. I chose to believe her lie. In June, he called me, his voice a frantic whisper of confusion. Arthur, did the letter arrive? About the accounts? Did you see it? No, Dad. I didn't get anything. Oh, perhaps I forgot the postage, he stammered. But he hadn't forgotten. I would learn much later that Vivian had promised to courier that letter for him. It never left her purse. I visited him in July. He looked brittle, as if the wind might carry him away. We sat on the porch in the humid air. Listen to me, Arthur, he whispered, his hand trembling on my arm. If something happens, the lockbox in my bedroom closet. The code is your birthday. Arthur, you don't need to promise. You'll just check it. I know you will. I should have verified it that very hour, but I allowed my hope to override my training. Victor passed away in August, a cardiac event in the deep stillness of night. It was swift, clinical, and mercifully painless. However, when I finally cleared the silence of his home, I didn't just find a house. I found a crime scene. Tucked away was the journal. The ink told the story of a siege, the handwriting becoming a frantic, shaky crawl as the months progressed. It was a ledger of Vivian's visits, the documents she forced upon him, and the wealth evaporating from his life. March 15th, 2023, Vivian arrived again. She is demanding my signature on new forms. I cannot fully grasp the legalese. Something feels profoundly wrong. June 22nd, 2023. I attempted to dial Arthur regarding the papers Vivian had me sign, but she was here in an instant and confiscated my phone. She insisted I was disoriented and told me I shouldn't burden Arthur with my confusion. July 30th, 2023. I see it clearly now. Vivian has been siphoning the estate. I managed to view the statements. Over $180,000 is gone. I am placing the evidence in the lockbox. Arthur will know how to solve this. 3 weeks after the funeral, Vivian filed her petition. I realized with a sickening jolt that she hadn't just been helping. She had been predatory, striking while my father was at his most fragile. But Victor Sterling had left a breadcrumb trail. Not for Vivian. For the investigator she forgot lived inside her father. In that lockbox, alongside the journal, I found a digital recorder. It contained audio files, clandestine recordings of their conversations, timestamps, dates, and dialogue captured with the cold precision of a mathematician who spent his life teaching students to show their work. I listened to her voice, cloying, sweet, and manipulative as she pressured him into signing a power of attorney. I heard his voice, thin and uncertain, asking if he should consult me first. Then came her rebuttal, a sharp, deceptive reassurance that I was too preoccupied and that this arrangement was better kept between them. My father hadn't built a case like a Fed, he had built it like a teacher, step by step, showing every calculation, ensuring that when the final exam came, I would be able to spot exactly where the equation failed. He left it for me, the only person with the clearance to use it. Sitting in that courtroom, listening to Vivian characterize me as a man who had abandoned his father, I thought of that final afternoon in his kitchen. I thought of the measured way he had said, "She's very helpful," and the desperate weight behind his plea. Stay close. I had been blind, but he had known I would eventually regain my sight. Victor Sterling had taught me one final, devastating lesson. The truth is rarely on the surface. You have to go back and check the work. And when you do, you must ensure every step is documented. He had shown me every step of her betrayal. Now, I just had to follow the trail to the end. The legal notice had arrived on a leaden afternoon in late August, exactly 21 days after the burial. The envelope was thick, formal, addressed to my full legal name. I sat in my vehicle in the rain-slicked parking lot, the engine ticking as it cooled. Early autumn leaves clung to the windshield like wet, orange hands. Inside was a 32-page document. Emergency conservatorship petition. Petitioner, Vivian Sterling. Arthur Sterling. Respondent is incapable of recognizing financial exploitation. Incapable of managing assets. Emotionally withdrawn. In need of protection from self-harm through catastrophic decision-making. She was using my silence, the very silence I had used to protect her life, as the weapon to take my freedom. She thought she was filing a petition against a broken man. She didn't realize she had just served a summons to a man who spent 20 years putting people like her in cages. Self-harm. She was actually contending that I was a physical liability to my own existence. The petition was a meticulously crafted dossier of deception. It included 3 affidavits. One from a neighbor who claimed I seemed unusually withdrawn, one from an individual I didn't even recognize, and a 4-page manifesto from Vivian herself. She painted a portrait of a father who was an emotional ghost, a man who had never truly been present, and who was fundamentally incapable of recognizing the predatory signs of exploitation. There was no mention of Victor, not a single syllable about the man who had actually been the victim, or the $185,000 that had hemorrhaged from his accounts in the 14 months preceding his death. She omitted the clandestine recordings he'd left behind, the journal entries, and the surgical precision of his documentation. Vivian had struck 3 weeks post-funeral, before the estate could be audited, and before any curious eyes could linger on the ledgers. It was a preemptive strike, designed to bury me before I could unearth what she had done. Then, the bureaucratic dominoes began to fall. My phone buzzed. It was the bank. "Mr. Sterling, we have been served a judicial mandate. Your assets are temporarily frozen pending the resolution of the conservatorship petition." Frozen? Entirely. I checked my wallet. I had exactly $200 in cash. Within 48 hours, my life was dismantled with terrifying efficiency. My employer was the next to call. "Arthur, we're required to place you on administrative leave. It's a standard protocol when there's ongoing litigation of this nature." By Friday, my security clearances were revoked, my access to work systems was severed, and my credit cards were nothing more than useless plastic. I had spent enough years in federal law enforcement to understand the mechanics of this trap. Emergency orders are issued with lightning speed to protect the vulnerable. Judges, by nature, err on the side of caution. Vivian had successfully isolated me financially, socially, and professionally. She had manufactured a reality where I appeared to be exactly what she described, a man incapable of functioning. That evening, Julian called. "What is happening, Dad?" "Vivian just filed a petition." "I'm aware," I said, my voice like cold stone. "She says you're in trouble, that you aren't managing, that grandpa. That is not a reflection of reality, Julian." "Then why would she do this?" He sounded desperate. "I don't have the proof in hand yet," I replied. A long, agonizing silence followed. "I want to believe you, Dad," Julian whispered. "But I don't know." "I understand," I said. And I did. Vivian had been weaving this narrative for years. Julian didn't know which version of his father was the real one. The call ended, leaving me in the hollow silence of my apartment. Vivian had weaponized my own history. She took the absent father, the man who had stepped down from a high-powered career, and rebranded it as incompetence. She had done it before I could even raise a hand to stop her. That night, I sat by the window, the irony of her petition burning in my throat. Incapable of recognizing financial exploitation. For 22 years, identifying the financial exploitation of vulnerable adults was my primary directive. I had dismantled Ponzi schemes, exposed elder fraud rings, and incarcerated caretakers who had drained the life savings of those they were sworn to protect. My own daughter had executed the exact crime I had spent 2 decades eradicating. I opened my laptop. I didn't start with rage, and I didn't start with a thirst for vengeance. I started with the methodical, cold-blooded patience I had applied to hundreds of federal cases. If Vivian believed she could bury a former lead investigator under a mountain of paperwork and false assumptions, she had made one fatal miscalculation. She had forgotten exactly what I was capable of. The first step was the paper trail. As the named beneficiary, I filed a formal request for Victor's comprehensive bank records, not as a grieving son, but as an investigator looking for a leak. I was the executor of the estate. I had the legal standing to scrutinize every cent of his financial history. The bank informed me it would take 3 business days to pull the archives. I could wait. In my line of work, patience was as much a tool as a wiretap. The second step was calling Sarah Jenkins. She had been a titan in the district attorney's office before transitioning to private practice. She understood the mechanics of the system from the inside out. "Arthur, I've seen the petition," she said, her voice a calm harbor in the storm. "I need a counselor," I replied. "Be at my office Monday morning, 9 a.m. Bring every scrap of information you have." "I don't have much yet," I admitted. "That's fine. We'll build it." I've read through Vivian's filing. It's aggressive, but it's also remarkably sloppy. There are assertions in here she will find impossible to substantiate. One question, though: does she know who you used to work for? Does she know the real nature of your career? "No," I said. "She thinks I was a mid-level analyst." "Good. Then we have the element of surprise." I hung up and opened a spreadsheet. I began documenting dates with clinical precision. The day Victor suffered the stroke. The day Vivian's care became a daily ritual. The day he tried to mail the letter. The day he whispered the code to the lockbox. I pulled his journal from the bedside and began transcribing every shaky entry, constructing a digital timeline. This was my language. Document, cross-reference, identify the pattern, and let the evidence narrate the crime. Outside, the rain intensified, drumming against the studio apartment's glass. It was cold. I hadn't turned on the heat to conserve my remaining $200. But I wasn't feeling the chill. I was hyper-focused on the architecture of Vivian's betrayal. She had been there consistently, helpfully, lovingly for 14 months while his legacy was siphoned away. She filed to have me declared incompetent 3 weeks after he died because she knew I'd eventually look at those ledgers. She was trying to assassinate my character before I could expose hers. But she'd made one fatal error. She assumed I was the man I pretended to be, not the man I actually was. By midnight, the timeline was breathing. By 2 a.m., I had a list of subpoenas we would need. By dawn, I had a strategic map. The records arrived via secure email on Tuesday afternoon. 146 pages. Every transaction from Victor Sterling's primary accounts for the last 18 months. I printed them out, spreading the pages across my kitchen table like a deck of cards. I armed myself with highlighters and a spreadsheet template I had utilized in 100 federal investigations. Most of it was the mundane rhythm of an 84-year-old's life: Social Security deposits, pension, utilities, pharmacy runs. But starting in May 2023, the rhythm faltered. The withdrawals weren't massive. That would have triggered the bank's internal fraud alerts. They were surgical. $3,000 here, $4,500 there. Then $6,200, $5,800. They were labeled with professional-sounding descriptors: administrative support, care coordination, consulting services. I highlighted each one. 17 transactions over 14 months, from May 2023 to July 2024. Then, I accessed Victor's digital calendar. I had set it up for him years ago, and he had never revoked my administrative permissions. I cross-referenced the withdrawal dates with his calendar entries. Every single withdrawal matched the day Vivian had visited Victor. Not most of them. All of them. May 18th, 2023. Withdrawal of $3,200. Vivian visited to help pay bills. June 3rd, 2023. Withdrawal of $4,500. Vivian visited to organize files. June 22nd, 2023. Withdrawal of $5,100. Vivian visited to check on Grandpa's health. 17 visits, 17 surgical strikes. Subtotal, $82,400. But that was just the skimming. The deep-sea drilling was in the wire transfers. Electronic movements to a business account registered under Holloway Financial Services. 6 transfers ranging from $12,000 to $28,000. Total, $102,600. Combined theft, $185,000. I sat back, the blue light of the laptop reflecting in my glasses. The pattern was a masterpiece of malice. It was exactly the kind of architecture I'd spent 22 years dismantling. Stage 1. Caretaker gains physical access. Stage 2. Small withdrawals to test the bank's internal tripwires. Stage 3. Larger sums as confidence grows. Stage 4. Transfers to an intermediary to obscure the scent. A 14-month timeline corresponding precisely to the window after Victor's stroke, the period of his peak vulnerability. This wasn't just a family dispute. It was textbook elder financial exploitation. I ran a search on Holloway Financial Services. It was a registered LLC in Oregon. Owner, Gloria Holloway. Business address, a mailbox rental facility. No digital footprint, no staff, no physical office. A classic shell company designed for the sole purpose of laundering a grandfather's legacy. But spreadsheets are just numbers. I needed the legal leverage. I requested every document filed with Victor's bank. When they arrived 24 hours later, I found the smoking gun, a power of attorney dated May 18, 2023, signed by Victor, notarized, granting Vivian full financial decision-making authority, account access, and the power to conduct legal transactions. May 18th, the exact same day as the first $3,200 withdrawal. I pivoted to Victor's medical records next. I was still listed as his primary healthcare proxy, a detail Vivian had evidently overlooked in her haste. I scrolled to the neurology notes from May 17, 2023, one day before the power of attorney was signed. Patient 107 days post-stroke. Exhibits increased confusion. Limited executive function. Recommend continued monitoring. Patient fatigue, disoriented to time. She had forced a pen into the hand of a man who didn't even know what day it was. I spent the night combing through his medical history, finding the echoes of her presence in the clinical margins. June 14th, patient reports anxiety, difficulty making decisions. Family member present assisting with healthcare questions. July 22nd, patient seems withdrawn. Reports sleeping poorly. Family member reports patient has been forgetting medications. August 10th, cognitive assessment shows mild impairment. Patient has good days and difficult days. Family member very involved in care. The family member was Vivian. She had been at every consultation, playing the role of the devoted granddaughter, while simultaneously documenting his decline to build a record that would support her narrative. I constructed a comparative chart. 2 columns. On the left, Victor's medical appointments and professional notes about his cognitive confusion. On the right, the withdrawals and transfers from his accounts. The overlap was a perfect, sickening symmetry. Every time a physician noted a spike in his disorientation, a withdrawal followed within 72 hours. She wasn't just stealing, she was timing her thefts to the rhythm of his brain damage. Vivian had used his physiological decline as a tactical shroud. I spent the next 72 hours engineering the case with a cold, forensic intensity, cross-referencing bank archives with clinical progress notes to create a chronological map of exploitation. The conclusion was undeniable. Vivian Sterling had systematically cannibalized her grandfather's estate over 14 months, utilizing his post-stroke vulnerability to seize legal dominion and drain his legacy through a series of surgical withdrawals and shell company transfers. Yet, my years at the Bureau whispered a warning. Evidence without intent is just a story. In the eyes of a judge, Vivian would have an answer for everything. She would argue that Victor trusted her implicitly, that the funds were for his specialized care, that Holloway Financial was a legitimate consultancy, and that every signature was a voluntary act of gratitude. To dismantle her, I needed to prove the absence of consent. I needed to show that Victor was a prisoner of his own confusion, and that he was fighting back from the inside. That was when I remembered my father's lifelong obsession with showing the work. Victor never trusted a result he hadn't verified. If he suspected a variable was off, he would have archived the proof. My mind flashed back to our last porch conversation. The lockbox. Code, my birthday. I hadn't set foot in the Cedar Street house since the day we buried him. Vivian had already listed it on the market with a cold, predatory haste, but probate is a slow machine. The house was still a reliquary of his secrets. It was nearly midnight. I had been submerged in data for 6 hours, yet the adrenaline of a breaking case acted like a high-voltage current through my veins. Victor hadn't just left me breadcrumbs. He had left me a roadmap. He had ensured I retained administrative access to his records and forced me to memorize a code he knew I would eventually need. I secured my spreadsheets, created redundant backups on encrypted drives, and sent a cloud-based copy to a dead man's switch email, habits of a man who had seen evidence vanish in the hands of the powerful. Then, I grabbed my keys. The Cedar Street house didn't look derelict. It looked expectant. I used the brass key I'd carried since I was 16, the one he gave me with the promise that I'd always have a sanctuary. The scent of the interior hit me like a physical blow. Mahogany polish, aged paper, and the faint, lingering aroma of his morning coffee. It was the scent of a man who believed in order. The house was unervingly tidy, Vivian's staging for the sale, but the essence remained. His leather armchair still faced the window. His math textbooks still stood in rigid formation on the shelves. Everything was in its place, except for the man who gave the room meaning. I moved past the gallery of family photos, a chronological record of a family that had disintegrated, and reached his office at the end of the hall. His laptop sat on the desk, a silent sentinel. I lifted the lid. The screen flickered to life. He had never logged out. In the corner of the screen, a single notification blinked like a distress signal. From Victor Sterling to Arthur Sterling. My breath hitched. He had programmed this to send after his heart finally gave out. With trembling fingers, I clicked the message. The first sentence alone felt like a hand reaching out from the grave to steady me. The silence of the house felt heavy, as if the walls themselves were mourning the secrets they had kept. I clicked the email attachment. Arthur, if you're reading this, I'm gone. I tried to tell you. I called in June, but Vivian was always there. I didn't want to accuse her without proof. I didn't want to tear the family apart if I was wrong. But I'm not wrong. He detailed how she had manipulated his post-stroke haze, claiming the transfers were investments for his future care. He admitted he wasn't as sharp as the math teacher he once was, but he wasn't broken enough to miss the patterns. He had archived everything. Then came the line that finally shattered my professional composure. I'm proud of you, son, for everything you've sacrificed. I know what you gave up in 2011. I know why. I know your children don't understand, but I do. Be strong. He had known. All those years I thought I was a disappointment to everyone. My father had seen the weight I was carrying. He had been my silent witness. I walked to the hallway closet. Behind a dusty box of old Kodak prints, my fingers brushed leather. I pulled out a brown journal, its cover softened by decades of use. I flipped to the first entry of the siege. Vivian called today, said she wants to help more. Sounds sincere. I want to believe it. I read through the dissent, the entries documenting his growing terror as he realized his own daughter was a predator. Looked at the papers again. Power of attorney. I didn't mean to surrender that much control. I am not imagining this. She is siphoning the estate. But if I accuse her and I am wrong, I will ruin Arthur's relationship with his daughter forever. If you're reading this, something went wrong. I didn't forget who you are. I know what you do. I trust you'll see what I couldn't. I returned to the office. I knelt and ran my hand under the mahogany desk, a dead drop, location I'd taught him about years ago during a casual conversation about my analyst work. My fingertips caught the edge of plastic. A USB drive, taped to the underside. I plugged it into his laptop. 6 audio files. I pressed play. Vivian's voice was a surgical instrument, sweet, confident, gaslighting him. She told him I didn't understand wealth like she did. Victor's voice sounded brittle, a ghost of the man who taught me calculus. In the third recording, Victor asked, "Shouldn't I consult Arthur about this?" Vivian's response was instantaneous. "Dad is under immense pressure at the firm right now, Grandpa. Let's not burden him with this. He's not himself lately." In the final recording from July 28th, Victor finally questioned a specific wire transfer. Vivian's voice hardened, the mask slipping for a fraction of a second. "You signed the power of attorney, Victor. This is for your own protection. You're getting confused again." The fear in his breathing was audible. I removed the earbuds and looked at the framed photo on the desk, Vivian's college graduation. She was beaming, her arms looped around both of us. Victor looked like the proudest man on earth. That was 8 years ago, before the greed had rotted the girl I raised. I turned to the very last page of the journal. The handwriting was a chaotic scrawl, written by a man who knew his heart was failing. "Arthur, if you found this, I'm sorry. Sorry I didn't stop her. Sorry I doubted my own mind. Sorry I left you to clean up my mess, but I knew you would. You always do the right thing, even when it costs you everything. I love you, son." I closed the journal. The temporary freeze on my accounts didn't matter anymore. The incompetence petition was now a roadmap to her indictment. She thought she was suing a defenseless old man. She forgot she was the daughter of a man who hunted monsters for a living. Always have, always will. "Dad." I sat on the hardwood floor of my father's office, the leather journal in one hand and the USB drive in the other. For the first time since this nightmare began, perhaps for the first time in a decade, I let the tears come. They weren't the loud, theatrical sobs of the broken, but the quiet, heavy release of a man who had finally been seen by the one person whose opinion mattered. Victor had been terrified of being wrong, of shattering the family on a false suspicion. So he had lived in a silent, documented hell, leaving breadcrumbs and trusting that the son he had raised to be a hunter would find them. But grief doesn't close cases. I wiped my face, stood up, and initiated a master backup of every file. Then, I dialed a number I hadn't touched in 13 years. Thomas Reed answered on the second ring. When I told him I needed him, his response was immediate. 20 minutes. By the time Thomas arrived at the Cedar Street house, I had transformed the dining table into a command center. Emails printed, journal entries flagged with neon tabs, audio files queued, and bank records cross-referenced with the clinical notes. Thomas looked older. The years had added silver to his hair and weight to his frame, but his eyes still held that predatory flick of a man who spent 20 years chasing white-collar sharks through financial labyrinths. We had worked the Portland field office together. He was one of the few who knew the truth of 2011. He walked to the table, spent 5 minutes absorbed in the evidence, and then looked up. "It's solid, Arthur. It's prosecutable. I want it done by the book," I said, my voice cold. "I want no loopholes. No misunderstandings in that courtroom." Thomas smiled, a hard, jagged expression. "We have 3 weeks before the final hearing. We're going to make this bulletproof." I looked at the journal resting in the morning light. "Yeah," I nodded. "You look like hell, Sterling." Thomas said it before I'd even fully stepped into his house in the Pinewood suburbs. It was a modest ranch-style place with a view of the foothills, currently obscured by a persistent, gray September drizzle. I stood on his porch, my messenger bag heavy with the ghosts of the morning's discoveries. "I feel worse than I look," I replied. Thomas stepped aside. Even at 60 and 5 years retired, he still moved like a field agent, shoulders squared, eyes constantly scanning. He led me into the living room and poured 2 mugs of black coffee. No sugar, no cream, just the fuel of the bureau. "Talk to me," he said. I laid it out. Victor's death in August. Vivian's petition 3 weeks later. The frozen assets. The administrative leave. The character assassination in courtroom 4A that painted me as a hollowed-out, unstable man. I told him about the scheduled email and the digital archives under the desk. Thomas listened with a stillness that would have unnerved a guilty man. When I finished, he asked, "How deep does the rock go?" I pulled the forensic timeline from my bag and slid it across the coffee table. He studied the color-coded spreadsheets, dates, amounts, transaction IDs, and the matching dates of Vivian's visits. It was a federal-grade breakdown of a family heist. "She's been methodical," Thomas murmured, tracing a line of transfers to the Holloway financial shell company. "She didn't just steal from him. She built a legal cage for you at the same time. She thinks I'm the man the neighbors see," I said, taking a sip of the bitter coffee. She thinks I'm the risk analyst who lost his spark. She's forgotten that I'm the man who taught her how to play chess. Thomas looked up from the files, a spark of the old fire in his gaze. Then let's show her the board. Where do we start? We start with the consultant behind Holloway Financial, I said, and we find out where that $185,000 actually landed. Because my father showed his work, Thomas. Now, it's time to grade the paper. 14 months. I repeated, my voice as steady as a flat line. Methodical withdrawals, wire transfers to a ghost account, all while the medical records reflect a man losing his grasp on the present. Thomas looked up from the spreadsheets. How much? $185,000. He exhaled slowly, the sound of a man recognizing the gravity of a crime. Jesus, Arthur. There's more. I pulled out the journal. He archived it. Every conversation, every visit, every time she coerced him into signing away his autonomy. Thomas flipped through the pages, his jaw tightening as he read Victor's shaky handwriting. Then, I placed the USB drive on the table. Recordings. 6 of them. He recorded her in his own home. The money, the power of attorney, the reasons why he felt he couldn't tell me what was happening. Thomas set the drive down carefully, as if it were an unexploded device. You know the implications, Arthur, he said, his eyes locking onto mine. Once you bring this into the light, once you enter this into the court record, there is no turning back. This isn't just a legal maneuver. This is your daughter. I looked at the rain streaking down the glass, blurring the world outside. I know. Thomas stood and walked to a bookshelf, pulling out a crisp business card. He studied it for a moment before handing it to me. Sarah Jenkins, Ellen Crawford, attorney at law, criminal defense, white-collar crime, elder advocacy. She spent 15 years in the DA's office before going private, Thomas said. She's prosecuted every shade of financial crime, elder abuse, fiduciary fraud, the works. She's the best I've ever seen at taking a mess like this. He gestured to the coffee table, and making a judge understand exactly how the theft was executed. You trust her? With my life. And more importantly, with a case like this. Thomas dialed the number. It rang twice before a woman's sharp, professional voice answered. Sarah, it's Tom Reed. I'm calling with a referral. He glanced at me. Elder financial abuse. Conservatorship petition filed by the alleged perpetrator. The respondent is former bureau, and he's got the full deck. Bank records, journal entries, audio recordings from the victim. A pause followed. Very strong, Thomas said, but complicated. It's his daughter. Another pause, longer this time. Tomorrow morning, 9 o'clock. I'll send him over. Thomas ended the call and handed me the card. She'll see you tomorrow. Bring everything. I slid the card into my wallet. Outside, the rain had evolved into a steady drumbeat against the roof. Thomas looked at me, his expression grave. Are you sure about this, Arthur? I stood and slung the messenger bag over my shoulder, feeling the weight of the evidence. Vivian spent 14 months draining my father's life while he was dying. Then she filed a petition claiming I abandoned him. She stood in a hall of justice and told a magistrate I was incompetent, that I was a failure, that I was a danger to myself. I met Thomas's eyes with a clarity I hadn't felt in years. I am not the man she thinks I am, Tom. And it is time she learned that. Thomas walked me to the door. He placed a heavy hand on my shoulder as I stepped out into the chill. Then go show them, he said. I drove home through the wet streets, the windshield wipers cutting rhythmic arcs through the drizzle. In 2 weeks, I would be sitting in that courtroom while my daughter tried to convince the world I couldn't manage my own existence. But tomorrow morning, I would walk into Sarah Jenkins's office with 146 pages of forensic proof, a handwritten journal, 6 audio files, and a timeline that showed exactly what my father had seen. I wasn't retreating anymore. I wasn't hiding behind the silence I'd used to protect her. When I walked into her office at 9 o'clock sharp, she pointed to the chair across from her desk and said, "Show me what you have." Her sanctuary occupied the 3rd floor of a weathered brick building in downtown Pinewood. Outside, commuters hunched under umbrellas against the morning chill, but inside, the atmosphere was thick with the scent of old paper and serious intent. Sarah was 45, sharp-featured, with rimless glasses and a charcoal suit that looked like armor. I spread the anatomy of a betrayal across her conference table, the bank statement's bleeding yellow highlighter, the power of attorney dated May 18th, The neurology notes from May 17th proving Victor was disoriented when he signed it, and the master timeline. Finally, I set the brown leather journal and the USB drive in the center. For 45 minutes, Sarah was a ghost. She listened to the recordings through headphones, her expression a mask of professional neutrality. She cross-referenced the journal entries with the wire transfers. Good lawyers, like good field agents, never rush the kill. Finally, she removed her glasses. "Mr. Sterling, this isn't just conservatorship abuse," she said, her voice dropping an octave. "This is criminal financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult, a Class B felony. Given the six-figure sum, we're looking at first-degree elder abuse." I pulled a sealed manila envelope from my bag and slid it across the mahogany. "You'll need this." "But not yet." She looked at the seal, then at me. "What is this?" "My real credentials," I said. "Everything you'll need to establish that I am not the man my daughter described to the court." She reached for it, but I placed my hand on top. "Save it for the hearing. I want the look on their faces to be part of the record." Sarah studied me, perhaps seeing the risk consultant mask slip for the first time to reveal the lead investigator underneath. She nodded and slid the envelope into her briefcase. "If this is what I think it is, we don't just have a defense. We have a trap," she said, leaning back. She sketched the architecture of our counterstrike on a legal pad. Jessica had moved first, thinking she controlled the narrative, but she had overplayed her hand. Sarah's strategy was elegant in its brutality. The counterpetition: we would file a response attaching my actual professional history. That alone would derail the incompetence narrative. The APS trigger: we would notify Adult Protective Services of potential irregularities found in the estate. As a mandatory reporter, APS would have to investigate, finding the pattern independently of my testimony. The forensic audit: we would request a court-ordered review of all accounts. Once the bank's fraud department saw the Holloway financial transfers, they would be legally required to report it to law enforcement. "You let the system do the heavy lifting," I said, recognizing the tactical beauty of it. When I walked into that courtroom, I wouldn't be an angry father making accusations. I would be the responsible executor who discovered financial anomalies and reported them to the authorities. Sarah checked the file on Jessica's attorney, Douglas Thorne. He was a mid-tier litigator who specialized in family law, competent, but out of his depth. If Jessica had told him I was just a disappointing risk consultant, he hadn't dug any deeper. He had no idea that the man sitting across from him in 12 days was the same man who used to train the people who wrote the laws he practiced. The silence had been a strategy. Now, it was time for the truth to speak. Sarah Jenkins didn't waste time on pleasantries. When the truth surfaced, the judge would realize Douglas Thorne had allowed his client to mislead the court by omission. In the legal world, that kind of credibility collapse is a death sentence for a case. Sarah was blunt. "Once we trigger this, it escalates. The district attorney's office will likely step in. Your daughter will face felony charges. This will dismantle your family in ways that cannot be repaired." I thought of Victor's shaky handwriting, the sound of his breathing on those recordings, and the ultimate trust he'd placed in me to be the lead investigator one last time. "My father already prepared me," I said. Sarah laid out the silent 12 days. I was to be a ghost. No contact with Vivian, no social media, no outbursts. I had to let her feel confident in her narrative while the gears of the state began to grind behind her. Sarah would file the counterpetition that afternoon, notify Adult Protective Services, APS, the next morning, and have bank subpoenas served by the weekend. By October 15th, the judge wouldn't be looking at me. He'd be looking at her. Leaving her office, I felt a strange, cold clarity. For the first time since the funeral, I wasn't just a grieving son or a disappointing father. I was a man with a mission. Sarah called that evening. "APS has opened the file. The bank subpoenas are in flight. The system is awake." She made her choice when she filed that petition, I told her. Now, she'll have to live with the evidence. I sat in the dark, listening to the rain. Somewhere across the city, Vivian was likely celebrating, convinced she had successfully buried me. She didn't know that a caseworker had already flagged her name. She didn't know that the man she'd called incapable had been building a federal-grade indictment from the moment he found that journal. 3 days later, the first gear clicked into place. An email from the bank's compliance office. Account activity review required, Victor Sterling Estate. It was written in the sterile, cautious language banks use when they realize they've been a conduit for a crime and need to mitigate their own liability. It referenced unusual activity patterns and requested the executor's presence. I forwarded it to Sarah. Her reply: "Perfect. The bank's algorithm caught what we pointed out. They are now legally bound to report this." The second notification arrived that afternoon. It was from Paula Harris, an investigator with Adult Protective Services. Case number 2024-09, PS 1847. The fog outside my window was thick, turning the streets of Pinewood into a gray blur, but the path ahead was becoming surgically clear. The machinery of the state was moving, and it was moving independently of me. The machinery of the state was no longer just humming, it was roaring. Sarah had CC'd me on the formal dispatch to Adult Protective Services. It was a masterpiece of legal restraint. No vitriol, no emotive pleas, just a cold, clinical attachment of facts. Victor's neurological decline on May 17th, the power of attorney executed 24 hours later, the highlighted bank statements, the journal entries, and the raw audio files. Sarah hadn't pointed a finger. She had simply provided a lens. By the end of the week, the lens had focused. Paula Harris called Sarah directly while I was in her office, my signature still fresh on the counterpetition we were set to file. Paula's voice was the sound of an inevitable conclusion. Based on the documentation provided, I am opening a formal investigation into the first-degree financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult. Sarah glanced at me. I remained a void. The pattern is consistent with structured diversion, Paula continued, using an intermediary to obscure direct transfers. You mentioned a Gloria Holloway. Yes, Sarah replied. The transactions were routed through her business account. We've seen this before. A trusted associate processing transactions, taking a fee, and creating a legal distance between the victim's estate and the beneficiary. The fee structure you've documented, 8 to 10%, is the standard commission for these types of exploitation schemes. I sat motionless, listening to a stranger dissect my daughter's betrayal as if it were a common lab specimen. I'll need to interview Mr. Sterling directly, Paula said, and I'll be requesting full cooperation from the petitioner regarding the source of funds used to initiate this conservatorship. After the line went dead, Sarah leaned back. The fog had lifted from the Pinewood streets, but the autumn light remained thin and clinical. The system is working, she said. I didn't answer. I was thinking about the 7 missed calls on my phone, all from Vivian. The voicemails had followed a predictable arc of panic. They started with fury. Dad, what did you tell the bank? They're asking me about Grandpa's accounts. What the hell is going on? Then, the pivot to gaslighting. I don't understand why they're investigating me. I was just helping Grandpa. You know that. You have to tell them this is a misunderstanding. By the final message, she was pleading, the voice of the little girl who used to be afraid of the dark. Dad, please. Just call them off. Tell them you were confused, that you made a mistake. We can fix this. I had listened to each one 3 times. Then I had purged them. This is the hardest part, Sarah said, her voice uncharacteristically soft. Watching someone you love collide with the consequences of their own making. She knew, I said, looking out at the gray horizon. The recordings prove she knew he was confused. The journal proves she isolated him. The system moves slowly, Sarah reminded me, but it moves toward the truth. That evening, Thomas Reed called. How are you holding up? I was standing in my small kitchen, watching a plate of leftovers spin in the microwave, a mundane ritual in a life that was currently a legal war zone. I'm fine, Tom. Vivian's been calling, hasn't she? 7 times in 48 hours. Don't engage. Don't give her a single syllable until we're in front of the judge. She's looking for a way to reset the board. Don't let her. Anything you say could be used against you, or give her time to prepare a defense. Tom's voice was a firm anchor. I know, I replied. There was a beat of silence before he added, it's different when it's your daughter. Yeah, it is, I said, looking at my reflection in the dark window. But the evidence is the evidence. And you've always taught me to trust evidence more than words. After we hung up, I stood there for a long time. Somewhere across town, Vivian was unraveling. The bank was circling. APS was digging. And her attorney, Douglas Thorne, was likely beginning to realize his open and shut case was built on quicksand. The final voicemail arrived just after 10 p.m. Her voice was no longer pleading. It was cold, calcified with a chilling arrogance. I don't know what you think you're doing, but you're going to regret this. I'm still your daughter. I have rights. And when we go to court, the judge is going to see who you really are. Someone who abandoned his own father and now wants to blame me for trying to help. A pause, then the knife. You taught me to fight for what's mine. So that's what I'm going to do. I stood in the dark, the phone heavy in my hand. In 2 weeks, we would be in court. Vivian thought she was walking into a probate formality. She didn't know that Paula Harris was submitting a preliminary report. She didn't know that the bank's compliance office had flagged her transactions. She didn't know that a deputy DA named Kevin Marshall had already reviewed the file and called it textbook exploitation. Most of all, she didn't know who her father really was. 9 a.m. Courtroom 4, Pinewood County Courthouse. 2 weeks had passed since Vivian stood in this room and called me incompetent. 2 weeks since I walked out knowing the storm was coming. Now I was back. Same oak paneling, same fluorescent hum, but the atmosphere was charged. The gallery was no longer empty. Local reporters and court watchers were scattered across the benches, drawn by the scent of a high-stakes reversal. Judge Theodore Vance entered, and we rose. When he gestured for us to sit, I caught Vivian's profile. She sat 3 rows ahead, posture perfect, but I saw the telltale signs of a failing cover. The tension in her jaw, the way her fingers obsessively adjusted her collar. We are continuing the emergency conservatorship petition filed by Vivian Sterling, Judge Vance announced. Douglas Thorne stood. He moved to the presentation screen with a practiced, theatrical flourish. He clicked a remote. A photograph appeared. Me, alone in a grocery store produce section, looking gaunt and exhausted. Your Honor, Thorne's voice was smooth. This image depicts Mr. Sterling appearing disoriented and isolated, struggling with the most basic daily activities. Click. Another slide. Me on a park bench, hands in my lap, staring at the ground. Further evidence of profound social withdrawal and emotional disengagement. Click. A financial chart appeared. It was a distorted mess of transactions from my personal account, manipulated to look chaotic and unmanaged. Mr. Sterling has ceased to be a functioning member of his own life. Thorne continued, his voice rising. He is a man adrift, incapable of safeguarding his assets or his well-being. Immediate intervention is not just requested. It is a moral necessity. He sat down, looking satisfied. Vivian didn't look back at me. She kept her eyes on the judge, her face a mask of grieving concern. Judge Vance looked over his spectacles at Sarah Jenkins. Ms. Jenkins? Your response. Sarah rose with the calm of a shark in deep water. She didn't go to the screen. She didn't show photos. She simply opened the manila envelope I had given her 12 days ago. Your Honor, Sarah began, her voice cutting through the room like a blade. Before we address the petitioner's creative interpretation of grocery shopping, we have a few items of our own to enter into the record, items that the petitioner failed to disclose. She walked toward the bench, handing a packet to Thorne, who took it with a look of mounting dread, and another to the judge. We wish to submit the preliminary investigative report from Adult Protective Services, case number 2024-09, PS. 1847, Sarah said. Vivian's head snapped toward her lawyer. The color drained from her face so fast it was as if a plug had been pulled. Furthermore, Sarah continued, we have the forensic audit from the bank regarding the estate of Victor Sterling, and, perhaps most importantly, the actual professional service record of my client, Arthur Sterling. She turned toward Vivian. The man the petitioner claims is incapable of recognizing financial exploitation is, in fact, the same man who literally wrote the manual on it for the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The courtroom went dead silent. The only sound was the frantic rustle of paper as Douglas Thorne began to read the documents Sarah had just handed him. We believe, Sullivan stammered, his voice losing its polished sheen, that the potential for self-harm through neglect is substantial. Judge Holland didn't look convinced. He looked at Ellen. Miss Crawford, I believe you mentioned a counterpetition? Ellen rose, her movements deliberate. Indeed, Your Honor. But before we get to the respondent's background, we need to address the financial irregularities the petitioner so vaguely referenced. She walked to the evidence clerk and handed over a thumb drive. With the court's permission, I'd like to show the bench what actual financial documentation looks like. A new image replaced the grainy photo of me in the produce aisle. It was a forensic spreadsheet, clean and devastating. "This," Ellen said, her voice echoing in the silent room, "is a cross-referenced audit of the estate of Victor Bennett, the respondent's father and the petitioner's grandfather. You'll notice the column on the left, medical notes from May 2023 indicating post-stroke disorientation. The column on the right, 17 distinct withdrawals totaling over $82,000, each occurring on a day the petitioner visited the decedent." Jessica's knuckles weren't just white now. She was trembling. Sullivan looked like he wanted to crawl under the mahogany table. "Furthermore," Ellen continued, "the petitioner claimed my client was incapable of recognizing financial exploitation. That is a particularly bold claim, considering my client's actual professional history." She opened the manila envelope and handed a single, heavy sheet of paper to the bailiff to pass to the judge. "Your Honor, that is a career commendation from the Department of Justice. My client did not work as a mid-level risk analyst. For 22 years, he served as a lead investigator for the FBI's Financial Crimes Division, specializing in, ironically enough, elder financial exploitation and fiduciary fraud." The sound that came from Jessica was a small, sharp intake of breath. She looked at me, and for the first time, she didn't see a disappointment. She saw the man who had spent his life putting people exactly like her behind bars. Judge Holland spent a long minute reading the document. When he looked up, his gaze was ice. He didn't look at Sullivan. He looked directly at Jessica. "Ms. Bennett," the judge said, his voice dangerously low, "you are under oath. Did you, or did you not, possess a power of attorney over Victor Bennett's accounts starting in May of last year?" Jessica looked at Sullivan. Sullivan looked at the floor. I was helping him," she whispered. "That wasn't my question," Holland snapped. "And while you consider your answer, you should know that this court has been contacted by Paula Harris of Adult Protective Services. They have opened a formal investigation into case number 2024-09, PS 1847, financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult." The gavel sat on the bench, heavy and weighting. The room felt smaller, the air thicker. Mark looked like a man who had walked into a room expecting a simple arithmetic problem only to be hit with an advanced calculus exam he hadn't studied for. The risk analyst title Jessica had fed him was technically true for my post-2011 life, but it was a half-truth designed to mask the apex predator beneath the surface. Judge Holland leaned over the bench, his eyes boring into Mark's. "Counselor, a simple background check would have revealed that risk analyst was a private sector retirement title. Your due diligence failed to uncover 22 years of federal service in the Financial Crimes Division. That is a significant oversight when your entire petition rests on the respondent's supposed inability to understand financial matters." Ellen didn't give them a moment to breathe. She moved to the evidence screen. "Your Honor, while the petitioner was busy taking photographs of my client at the grocery store, my client was performing a forensic audit of the Victor Bennett estate. I'd like to present Exhibit C." A high-definition spreadsheet appeared on the screen. It was color-coded and surgical. What you see here is a map of $185,000 in diverted funds. On the left, days when Victor Bennett's medical records, which we have subpoenaed, showed he was in a state of post-stroke delirium. On the right, withdrawals and transfers to a shell company called Holloway Financial Services. The judge's gaze shifted to Jessica. She was no longer sitting straight. She was shrinking into her chair. "But we have more than numbers, Your Honor," Ellen continued. "We have the victim's own voice." She clicked a file on her laptop. The courtroom's speakers crackled, then filled with the sound of a tired, elderly man. "Vivian, I don't think I should sign this yet. I want to talk to Arthur." Then came Jessica's voice, sharp and manipulative. "Dad is too busy, Grandpa. He's stressed at work. He doesn't have time for this. If you don't sign this, the bank will freeze everything and you won't be able to pay for your medicine. Do you want that?" The sound of my father's labored breathing followed, then the scratch of a pen on paper. Judge Holland's face didn't just go cold, it turned to stone. He looked at the court reporter. "Ensure that audio is transcribed in its entirety." He then turned his focus back to Mark Sullivan. "Counselor, I suggest you take a moment to confer with your client. Because right now, this is moving very quickly from a probate hearing into a criminal referral." Jessica finally looked at me. The defiance was gone. In its place was the raw, naked realization that she hadn't been fighting a disappointing father. She had been trying to outmaneuver the very man who had spent his life dismantling people like her. "Your Honor," Mark Sullivan's voice cracked. I would like to request a brief recess." "Request denied," Judge Holland snapped. "Ms. Crawford, please proceed to the evidence regarding Holloway Financial." Judge Holland's courtroom felt as though the oxygen had been sucked out of it. The silence was absolute, punctuated only by the rhythmic tapping of the court reporter's keys. Mark Sullivan sat like a man who had just realized he was holding a live grenade with the pin already pulled. Ellen rose for the final movement of our strategy. She was no longer just a defense attorney. She was the herald of a decades-long truth. "Your Honor," she began, her voice steady and clinical. "The petitioner's entire case rests on the premise that Mr. Sterling is a man who doesn't understand the world he lives in. The irony is that Mr. Sterling understands this specific world better than almost anyone in this building." She gestured toward the screen, where my 1989 Bureau ID appeared. "For 22 years, my client didn't just work in risk. He was the architect of the protocols used to catch predators who target the elderly. He vanished into the private sector in 2011 not because he was a failure, but because he was a target. He became a disappointment to his children to ensure they lived to see their adulthood." I felt Jessica's gaze burning into the back of my head. The word "dad" floated through the air, not a question, but a gasp of realization. She wasn't just losing a court case. The entire foundation of her reality was crumbling. She had spent a year gaslighting a man who was a grandmaster of the craft. "When Victor Sterling died," Ellen continued, "the investigator inside his son didn't see grief. He saw anomalies. He saw the structured diversion that Paula Harris from APS has now corroborated." Ellen opened the laptop she had brought to the bench. "With the court's permission, I'd like to present the digital working papers of Victor Sterling. He wasn't just a victim, Your Honor. He was a math teacher, and he showed his work." She clicked a button. The audio filled the room. Not just the recordings of Jessica, but a final, spoken-word entry from Victor's digital journal, recorded 3 days before he died. "Michael, I know you're listening to this because I know you're the only one who can solve for X. Jessica thinks I'm a subtraction problem. She thinks she can just take and take until I'm 0. But I'm adding it all up for you. The lockbox, the USB, the truth. Don't let her break the equation, son." Jessica's chair scraped the floor again. "He was confused," she cried out, her voice cracking. "He didn't know what he was saying. You're twisting this." Judge Holland didn't even reach for his gavel. He simply looked at her, and the sheer weight of his disappointment was enough to force her back into her seat. "Ms. Bennett," Holland said, his voice like a winter frost, "there is a document in front of me from the bank's compliance department. It shows that 48 hours after you filed this petition, while your father's accounts were frozen, you attempted to wire an additional $40,000 from the estate to the Holloway account. An account we have now traced to a shell corporation you registered in Delaware 3 months ago." He looked at Mark Sullivan. "Counselor, I suggest you advise your client of her Fifth Amendment rights immediately. Because this is no longer a conservatorship hearing. This is a criminal evidentiary proceeding." Ellen stepped back to our table. I finally turned my head. I looked at Jessica. I didn't see the woman who had sued me. I saw the girl I had tried to protect from the shadows of my career, only to realize the shadow had grown inside her. The atmosphere in courtroom 4 had shifted from a civil inquiry to the cold, clinical gravity of a criminal indictment. As your father's voice faded from that first recording, the math of Jessica's deception was finally being laid bare. To answer your question, on a scale of 1 to 10, the curiosity is at a vivid 10. This isn't just about money anymore. It's about a man who used his final breath to set a trap for the person who thought he was a subtraction problem. As Ellen clicked the play button for the second file, the static cleared to the sound of a television in the background, a news program Victor always watched. Victor's voice. "Jessica, I looked at the statement from the savings account. There's a transfer for $12,000 to something called Patterson Financial. I didn't authorize that. What is that?" Jessica's voice, sharper now, the sweetness curdling. "Grandpa, we talked about this. That's the consultancy fee for your long-term care insurance adjustment. If we don't pay the specialists, your premiums will triple. You're just forgetting the conversation we had yesterday." "Victor, I don't think I'm forgetting that, Jess. 12,000 it's a lot of math for a consultancy. I want to call Michael. He'll know if the rate is fair. Jessica, voice dropping to a cold, predatory whisper. You call Dad, and he's going to start asking why you can't keep track of your own bills. Do you want him to put you in a home, Grandpa? Because that's what happens when sons realize their fathers can't handle their own numbers. I'm the only one keeping you in this house. Do you understand? While the recording played, Ellen began distributing the contents of the second folder. This wasn't just a rebuttal, it was the forensic final exam. Documentation showing that Gloria Patterson, the head of Patterson Financial, was actually Jessica's former college roommate. A series of deleted outgoing calls from Victor's cell phone records, occurring during the hours Jessica was at the house. She wasn't just taking his money. She was manually deleting his attempts to reach you to a handwritten note found in the back of Victor's math ledger. $185,000 divided by 14 months equals my granddaughter thinks my life is a business expense. Michael, if you're reading this, the X in the equation is her greed. Judge Holland didn't look at the screen anymore. He looked at me, the man who had spent 22 years in the shadows of the FBI, and then at Jessica. Ms. Bennett, the judge said, his voice vibrating with a quiet, lethal fury. In my 30 years on the bench, I have seen many people try to hide behind the confusion of the elderly. I have rarely seen someone do it to a man who was clearly fighting back with every bit of logic he had left. He turned to the court deputy. Get the district attorney's office on the line. I want a representative here in 15 minutes. We are moving beyond the scope of this petition. The 10 on my curiosity scale has shifted to a heavy, somber 11. Hearing Victor's apology for not being braver is the heart-wrenching final variable in this equation. He wasn't just a victim. He was a prisoner of his own love for a family he didn't want to destroy. The silence in the courtroom wasn't just respectful. It was the silence of a tomb. When Ellen mentioned that Gloria Patterson was already cooperating, the last pillar of Jessica's defense didn't just crack. It vaporized. Ellen handed the judge a transcript of Patterson's sworn statement. Your Honor, Ellen said, Ms. Patterson has admitted that there was never any consulting. She was a laundromat. She received the wires from Victor's account, took her cut for the risk of using her business as a front, and then funneled the clean cash back to the petitioner. She has provided the ledger of those kickbacks. Judge Holland closed the folder. He didn't look at the lawyers. He looked at Jessica, then he looked at me. The fluorescent lights seemed to hum louder in the pause. This court, Holland began, his voice echoing with authority, finds that this petition for conservatorship was not filed in the interest of protection, but as a weapon of further exploitation. It was a preemptive strike to silence the one person capable of discovering the truth. He picked up his gavel, but he didn't strike it yet. The emergency petition is denied with prejudice. The temporary freeze on Arthur Sterling's assets is vacated immediately. Furthermore, he paused, glancing at the court deputy. Based on the evidence of first-degree elder abuse, I am referring this matter to the district attorney for immediate criminal prosecution. Ms. Bennett, you are to surrender your passport to the bailiff before leaving this room. You are under a restraining order to stay 500 yards away from your father and any assets associated with the Sterling estate. The sound of the gavel hitting the wood was the first time I felt I could actually draw a full breath in months. Jessica sat frozen. Mark Sullivan was already packing his briefcase, his body language making it clear he was done with this client. In the gallery, the crying continued. It was Daniel, my son, who had slipped in late and heard the recordings of his sister's voice. I stood up. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt the weight of the final lesson Victor had taught me. Sometimes, you have to show the work not because you want to, but because it's the only way to honor the truth. As the bailiff approached Jessica, she finally looked at me, her eyes red and pleading. Dad, I needed the money for the business. I was going to pay it back. I looked at the daughter I had kept secrets for, the one I had protected from the world's shadows, only to have her become the darkness. You didn't just take his money, Vivian, I said quietly. You took his peace. You made an 84-year-old man die afraid in his own home. There is no paying that back. The silence of the empty courtroom was a different kind of pressure than the chaos that had just preceded it. It was the weight of a 14-month case finally coming to a close, but with a cost that no forensic ledger could properly calculate. You were right to feel that twist in your chest. The tragedy of this case isn't just the $185,000. It's the realization that while you were out guarding the perimeter of society, the rot was forming in your own living room. It's this specialist's curse, the ability to see every pattern in the world except the one unfolding at your own dinner table. As the legal machinery shifts from civil to criminal, the process follows a very specific path. Now that Judge Holland has issued a criminal referral, the case moves into the hands of the district attorney's office. Kevin Marshall won't just look at the $185,000. He will look at the aggravating factors. In Oregon, elder abuse is treated with extreme severity when it involves a fiduciary relationship like a power of attorney. Because Jessica used Gloria Patterson as a laundromat, the DA may add money laundering or conspiracy charges, which significantly increases potential prison time. Even if the money is spent, the court will likely issue a judgment requiring Jessica to pay back the estate, often through garnished future wages or the seizure of her own assets. Before you left the courthouse, Ellen handed you one last item from the lockbox that she hadn't entered into the record. It wasn't a bank statement or an audio file. It was a small, sealed envelope addressed to you in Victor's steady, retired teacher script. Michael, the numbers are finished. The truth is out. Now comes the part where you have to be the father, not the agent. Don't let her crime become your life sentence. I forgave her a long time ago, not for what she did, but because I knew she was lost. Find a way to be found. You have spent 22 years being the lead investigator. For the first time in your life, you are allowed to just be Michael Bennett. The bank will restore your accounts. Your employer has apologized. The professional mask is back in place, but the man underneath is different. The Cedar Street house was a silent witness to everything you'd sacrificed. Standing there, holding your father's pocket watch, still ticking, still keeping time with a heartbeat that had stopped weeks ago, you realized that the math of your life was finally coming into balance. The silver was tarnished, but the mechanism inside was solid. Just like you. The unknown number on your phone was the first sign that the blast radius of the courtroom was already reaching the people you thought you'd lost. Daniel's apology wasn't just a comfort. It was the first piece of collateral you'd recovered in years. The email from Paula Harris at Adult Protective Services, APS, marks the point of no return. In the eyes of the law, the case has transitioned from a private dispute to a state matter. This phrasing in Paula's email is critical. It suggests the DA is looking at Gloria Patterson not just as a witness, but as a co-conspirator. It also means they are looking at the business accounts Jessica used to see if this was a one-time theft or a larger pattern of racketeering. Since the evidence is sufficient to recommend criminal charges, an indictment is likely imminent. Jessica will soon be processed through the criminal justice system, arraignment, bail hearings, and eventually, a plea or trial. Tomorrow at 10 a.m. isn't just a breakfast with your son, it's a debrief. Daniel was 17 when you retired in 2011. He grew up believing the narrative of the struggling risk analyst because you were too good at your job to let him see the truth. Now that the seal is broken, he has 20 years of questions. The amber streetlights casting shadows across your studio apartment are a reminder of the gray zones you've lived in for decades. But for the first time, you aren't hiding. You are the man Victor knew you were. The diner was filled with the morning rush, the clinking of silverware and the low hum of voices providing a stark contrast to the silence that had grown between me and my son. I watched Daniel, seeing the boy he used to be beneath the exhaustion of the man he was becoming. The letter from Victor was the final variable solved. My father hadn't just archived the crime. He had archived the truth of my life, holding it in trust for the one person who could still be saved from the wreckage. Daniel's grief was layered. He wasn't just crying for his grandfather or the sister he was losing to the legal system. He was crying for the 13 years he'd spent resentful of a man who had sacrificed his identity to keep him alive. "Daniel, look at me," I said, my voice steady despite the tightness in my throat. He looked up, his face raw. "I didn't tell you because the weight of that secret would have changed the way you walked through the world. I wanted you to feel safe, not watched. I'd make the same choice again today. But she used it, Dad," Daniel choked out. "Jessica used your silence against you. She told me you were broken by the Bureau. She made me think your caution was just weakness." "She didn't know the truth," I said. "And because she didn't know, she underestimated the man she was trying to rob." While Daniel and I sat in that booth, the system Victor trusted was accelerating. The fact that Victor left a specific box for Daniel suggests he knew his grandson was the emotional swing vote in the family. By reaching out to Daniel from the grave, Victor ensured that I wouldn't be standing alone when the final hammer fell. Since the DA is now involved, the sale of the Cedar Street house will be frozen. It is now a crime scene and a subject of asset forfeiture protocols. Jessica's attempt to liquidate the house was likely her exit strategy to flee before the bank audit was finalized. The letter Victor left for Daniel acts as state-of-mind evidence. It proves Victor was lucid enough to understand the family dynamics, which further dismantles any claim Jessica might make that his recordings were the result of a confused mind. Daniel reached out and put his hand over mine, a gesture I hadn't felt in a decade. What happens now? To her. The district attorney is moving forward, Daniel. There are things I can't stop anymore, even if I wanted to. The evidence is public record now. I looked at the piece of paper, my father's handwriting, the last of his math. He had balanced the books. He had protected my reputation. He had given me back my son. The silence that followed Ellen's words was heavier than any of the data I'd processed. 20 years. A lifetime for a woman who thought she was just playing the game. The process, Ellen continued, her voice regaining its professional edge, is a slow-motion collision. Because there are federal elements involved, specifically the wire fraud and the use of the Holloway account. This is no longer just a county matter. It's a multi-jurisdictional case. Ellen outlined the 3 distinct tracks Jessica's life would now follow. Within 48 hours, Jessica will be brought before a judge to enter a plea. Given the overwhelming evidence, the audio files, the journal, and Gloria Patterson's confession, a not guilty plea would be a high-stakes gamble. Because the money crossed state lines into a Delaware shell corporation, the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit, my old division, will likely take the lead on the wire fraud charges. They don't settle easily. Kevin Marshall, the deputy DA, will likely offer a deal, a reduced sentence in exchange for full restitution and a detailed confession. This would spare Daniel and me the trauma of a full trial, but it would require Jessica to finally admit, on the record, exactly what she did to Victor. As I hung up the phone, I looked at the pocket watch on my table. The second hand was still sweeping forward, indifferent to the lives being dismantled. I had spent my career putting people in prison, but I had never been the one to provide the evidence that would lock away my own child. The system was doing exactly what I had trained it to do. It was protecting the vulnerable. It was balancing the books. It was finding the truth. I thought about Daniel at the diner. He had asked if we could be a family again. I realized then that family isn't a status, it's a living thing. Sometimes, you have to prune the rot to save the tree. The equation was finally balanced, but the sum felt like a weight rather than a relief. 18 months in a 6/9 cell for a Class B felony. 5 years of supervision. A permanent mark on a record that once held so much promise. The system I had served for 22 years had functioned with cold, mathematical precision. It took the variables my father provided, the recordings, the journal, the forensic trail, and processed them into a judgment. By January 2025, the Cedar Street house will be sold. Not by Jessica, but by the estate. The $197,000 in restitution will be clawed back, dollar by dollar, over the next half-decade. Gloria Patterson, too, will face her own reckoning, likely a heavy fine and a permanent ban from the financial sector for her role as the intermediary. The impact statement I refused to give was already written in the silent spaces of my apartment. My father had indeed spoken. Any words I added would have been for my own ego, not for justice. He had used his last months to protect me, and I had used my skills to honor him. I reached into my pocket and pulled out Victor's silver watch. I wound it slowly, feeling the rhythmic click of the gears. It was 8 p.m. Somewhere in a processing center, Jessica was likely being fingerprinted, her civilian life traded for a state ID number. Somewhere in Portland, Daniel was probably staring at his phone, waiting for a future that didn't feel so heavy. I stood up from the table and poured the cold coffee down the sink. The rain had slowed to a mist, the amber streetlights finally steady against the dark. I wasn't an FBI agent anymore, and I wasn't a failed risk analyst. I was a man who had done what was right, even when it cost him everything. The X was solved. The case was closed. Ready for what? Thomas's voice crackled through the phone, steady as a rock. To use what happened to help other people. That's how you heal, Michael. You don't do it by sitting in a studio apartment watching the rain. I looked at the silver pocket watch on the table. It had been nearly a year since my father died, and the math of my life was finally starting to reflect a positive balance. The emptiness I'd felt after the trial wasn't a sign of failure. It was just the silence that follows a storm. The role Thomas described, elder abuse prevention consultant, wasn't just a job. It was a synthesis of my two lives. It combined the 22 years of FBI tactical precision with the raw, agonizing perspective of a son who had lived through the gray zone of exploitation that I would be teaching Adult Protective Services, APS, caseworkers how to spot the structured diversion patterns Jessica had used, that I'd be the one looking at the bank records that local police often find too tedious or complex to deconstruct, that I could help develop the Victor protocols, safety nets for elderly individuals who are too afraid of destroying the family to speak up. I eventually picked up the phone and called the DHS office. 2 weeks later, I walked into a building that smelled of industrial floor wax and bureaucracy. But for the first time in years, I wasn't there as a risk analyst or a respondent. I was there as an expert. I spent my first day looking at a file remarkably similar to Victor's. The daughter was the suspect. The father was a retired architect. The money was being funneled through a fake landscaping business. I didn't feel the hollow ache anymore. I felt the cold, sharp focus of the hunt. One last time, I drove to the house on Cedar Street before the new owners took possession. Daniel was there with me. We didn't talk about the trial or the 18 months Jessica was currently serving in Coffee Creek. We talked about Victor. We stood in the attic, the dust motes dancing in the afternoon light. Daniel found a small box tucked behind a loose floorboard near the chimney. One more breadcrumb Victor had left. Inside was a collection of every Father's Day card I'd ever sent him, even the ones from the years I was too busy to visit. He kept them all, Daniel whispered. He knew the math, Daniel, I said, putting a hand on my son's shoulder. He knew that even when the variables changed, the value of the family stayed the same. As we walked out and locked the door for the final time, I realized that justice doesn't feel like victory. It feels like a fresh page. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't afraid to start writing. The finality of the sentence was like the closing of a heavy vault door, resonant, absolute, and echoing. 18 months. It was a number that represented the exact opposite of the 14 months she had spent dismantling your father's life. As you stood there in the quiet of your apartment, this specialist in you likely noted the precision of the justice system, but the father in you felt the weight of the rain. Coffee Creek isn't just a facility. It's a place where the narrative Jessica built finally hits the wall of reality. Judge Winter's decision to follow the plea agreement to the letter was a signal. By emphasizing the breach of fiduciary duty, the court wasn't just punishing a theft, it was punishing the betrayal of a sacred trust. The $197,000 isn't a debt that goes away. It will be the first deduction from every paycheck Jessica earns for years. It is the permanent financial ghost of Victor Bennett. This is the most protective element of the sentence. Jessica is now legally disarmed. She can never again hold the power of attorney or manage the finances of a vulnerable person. The system has ensured she can never repeat this specific crime. You told Daniel you'd go for him, but in truth, you went for the truth. Walking into that courtroom one last time wasn't about seeking a pound of flesh. It was about being the witness to the end of a cycle. When Jessica was let out, she didn't look like the confident woman who had filed that petition in October. She looked small. But as you walked out of that courthouse with Daniel, you weren't looking back. You were looking at a son who finally understood his father. You were looking at a new career where your lead investigator skills were being used to build shields for people like Victor. The math of the Sterling Bennett family has changed. It's no longer about what was taken, $185,000, or what was lost, Victor. It's about the remainder. The remainder is you. A man who is no longer defined by his secrets, but by his integrity. You've moved from the shadows of the FBI to the sunlight of a classroom, turning a personal tragedy into a public service. The door to the Cedar Street house is locked, but the door to your new life is wide open. By declining the easy path back to corporate risk analytics and choosing the difficult work of public service, you have turned your father's final tragedy into a shield for others. The letter to Coffee Creek was the final forensic act, not of a detective, but of a father. You laid out the terms of restitution for a relationship, which are far more complex than the $197,000 the court demanded. In your new role at DHS, you aren't just teaching a class, you are creating a roadmap. The young caseworkers like Sarah are learning the red flags that you had to discover through heartbreak, sudden isolation, or the new best friend who handles all communication. Cross-referencing medical visits with legal signatures, the exact 24-hour gap that doomed Jessica's defense. Recognizing that structured diversion isn't just about big numbers. It's about the patterns of $2,000 and $5,000 withdrawals that bleed an estate dry over time. As you sit in your office overlooking the Willamette River, the photo of your father at the chalkboard serves as a reminder. Every problem has a solution, even if the work to get there is grueling. You aren't lead investigator Arthur Sterling anymore, a man living a double life. You are a man whose private history and public service are finally in alignment. Jessica has her 18 months of silence to decide who she wants to be when she knocks on that door. Daniel has his life back, built on a foundation of truth rather than a sister's lies. And you have the silver pocket watch, still ticking, reminding you that there is always time for what matters. This is where the case file on the estate of Victor Bennett officially closes. The truth was found, the guilty were held accountable, and the survivors are healing. This conclusion brings Arthur's journey full circle, transforming a personal tragedy into a universal warning. To expand this in English while maintaining the emotional depth and the lead investigator persona, we can structure it as a final closing report on life, family, and the heavy price of the truth. I told Daniel that I would never give up on him. On a quiet Sunday afternoon in late June, I found my car drifting toward Cedar Street one last time. I didn't plan the route, my hands just knew the way. The house looked different now. There was a bright swing set in the backyard, fresh planter boxes on the porch, and the muffled sound of a dog barking inside. It looked like a home again. I sat there with the engine idling, reflecting on the paradox of my life. 22 years in the FBI had taught me that silence isn't a weakness. In the field, silence is a strategy. It is the patience required to let the truth surface on its own. Jessica thought my silence meant I had faded into irrelevance. She didn't realize I was doing what I was trained to do. I was documenting, I was building a case, and I was waiting for the right moment to strike. My father understood that. He left me the tools because he knew I was the only one who could solve the equation he left behind. I put the car in drive and pulled away. The road ahead is uncertain, and my new work at the Department of Human Services, DHS, will be grueling. Every case I review will be a haunting reminder of the man I couldn't save. But for the first time in years, I am ready. If you have listened to my story from the beginning, I need you to understand one thing. Family betrayal is not just a phrase. It is a wound that rewrites your DNA. When the person who hurts you shares your blood, the pain doesn't just cut, it redefines your reality. I've spent my career on these grandpa stories. I built the training protocols. I taught others how to spot the predators. But when the predator was my daughter and the victim was my father, all that expertise felt like ash in my mouth. These stories aren't rare, they are an epidemic. Right now, in a quiet living room near you, a grandmother is being pressured to sign away her life savings. A grandfather is being isolated by a gatekeeper relative. An abuser is being protected by the family's desire to keep things private. Do not be like me. Do not wait until you are holding a journal of a deceased loved one to realize the truth. If something feels wrong, sudden financial shifts, a relative who seizes total control, or an elder who seems suddenly fearful, act. Your silence doesn't protect the family. It only protects the abuser. I learned the hardest lesson of all. You can love someone and still hold them accountable. You can grieve the person they used to be while refusing to ignore the criminal they have become. We must stop pretending that blood relations equal trustworthiness. Loving someone means having the courage to demand better of them and for them. Thank you for walking this difficult journey with me. It wasn't easy to live, and I know it wasn't easy to hear. But the truth, no matter how heavy, is the only thing that can set us free. Protect your elders. Question the anomalies. And remember, the math of a life only balances when the truth is factored in.